speakers today are brothers Jim and Philip Chow. Jim is an electrical engineer, receiving his degree from the University of Washington. He spent over 30 years in various high-tech companies in Silicon Valley and retired 4 years ago. He's been active in the nonprofit organization Friends of Children with Special Needs, which also known as FCSN, which he co-founded in 1996. He is currently on the board of directors with FCSN and on the Chinese Historical and Cultural Projects Advisory Board. He and his wife are residents of Fremont. His brother Philip is an architect, receiving his degree from the University of Washington and a Master's of Architecture degree from the University of Illinois. He worked for various architectural firms, as well as his own private practices, before retiring in 2016. He is a member of the Design Review Committee for the City of Pasadena and a member of the board of Prado for Homeowner Association. He and his wife live in Pasadena. Both Philip and Jim have been working in the canning industry for several summers. Oh, please turn off your cameras and microphones, if you can. Sorry. So both Jim and Philip are working in the canning industry for several summers while they're in college and have been researching this industry during their retirement. And I want to thank them so much for working with me. They've been working with CHSA and for over a year, and then with me for the past few months for building this program. And so we're really happy that they're here this November. So give them a big round of applause for joining us today. And I'm going to turn the show over to you guys now.
Thank you, Maggie. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. We have been in contact with CHSA since early this year, before the pandemic started. And I'm Jim, and I'm a retired electrical engineer from Silicon Valley. Currently, I'm serving as a volunteer co-chairperson of Friends of Children with Special Needs. With me here today is my twin brother, Philip.
I was an architect, and since retirement, I'm currently volunteering as a commissioner on the Design Review Commission for the City of Pasadena. I'm glad to join Jim today on this presentation.
Okay, behind me on my back screen, you can see a cannery which we worked at in Alaska. A few years ago, after I retired from my professional work, I started looking at the history of the salmon canneries. And I was surprised to find out that the Chinese workers were the backbone of this industry for over 40 years. You know, it's such a fascinating story that last year I asked Philip to join me in this study.
We know that salmon canning was an important industry for the northwestern states and Alaska, but just how important was it? In terms of economical value, canned salmon was the top-ranking product in Alaska in the first half of the 20th century. In the states of Washington and Oregon, just before World War II, the product ranks as number 3, right behind wheat and timber.
In northwestern states, salmon canneries provided thousands of job opportunities for Chinese migrants. And today, actually, they provide more jobs than many other industries, such as railroad construction and mining. Today, not many people are aware of the fact that the Chinese made a significant contribution in this industry.
The Chinese first entered into the labor market of the salmon canning industry back in 1870, exactly 150 years ago. So today, it's the perfect timing for us to call attention to the story of the Chinese migrants and the salmon canning industry. It is an important part of the Chinese-American history and also an important part of the history of the American West.
Even though today, most of the canneries are in Alaska, however, California played a key role in this industry. Sacramento was the birthplace of the first salmon cannery on the West Coast. And of course, San Francisco was home to many salmon canning companies, Chinese contractors, and thousands of workers. So it's really very special to be here with the CHSA to present this program.
Let me say a few words about ourselves. We were born and raised in Taiwan. We spent 3 years in Libya before coming to the States in 1968. In 1970, we just finished our freshman year at the University of Washington in Seattle, and we were looking for summer jobs in Alaska canneries. But the cannery jobs were controlled by a union. That's where our story will begin today, right inside the Union Hall. Please start the video.
This photo was taken in June 1970 in the hall of the Longshoremen's Union, Local 37. I'm the one standing in the middle, and Philip is to my left. Admission to the union was by no means automatic. It took some doing and lots of patience. After waiting for 5 weeks, we finally got dispatched on the last day to the last cannery. Philip spent 2 summers in Alaska, and I worked 3 summers. Philip, what do you remember from this picture?
We surely didn't look like cannery workers or union members. We stood out as the only Chinese inside the Union Hall. In fact, after the labor union came to power in 1936, very few Chinese were dispatched to Alaska. It was only after many years did we find out that historically, Chinese dominated the cannery labor market from 1870 till 1910. Today, so much has been forgotten, and we want to preserve this part of the Chinese-American history.
In part 1, we have 4 segments. We will talk about the following. First, the arrival of the Chinese. Second, the pioneers of the industry. Third, the birth of the salmon canning industry. And finally, the hiring of the first Chinese crew. Chinese has been coming to America since the gold rush days. This is the front page of Harper's Weekly, depicting the arrival of the ship Great Republic in San Francisco in 1869. You see the Chinese coming down the ship to the custom house. They gathered in groups and waited in silence. Each man carried his possession in baskets and bamboo pole. Inside the insert, you see the Chinese were carried away on a wagon by an agent from the 6 companies, which must have made arrangement for their stay. At the time, San Francisco was known to the Chinese as Gold Mountain.
Here is a view of San Francisco Harbor in the late 19th century. This is what the Chinese saw when they first set their eyes on the continent. They come with their hopes and dreams, and the new land seemed so promising. But I thought the timing of their arrival in 1869 was most interesting. 1869 was exactly the year when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. So, what were the future job prospects for the newly arrivals? One possibility was the salmon canneries, which started hiring Chinese in 1870.
We see here a picture of San Francisco in the late 19th century, a boom town of the West. San Francisco was the center of commerce, and where many major salmon canning companies would later be located. In fact, canning salmon soon became one of the most important industries for the northwestern states of Oregon, Washington, and Alaska.
For decades, thousands of Chinese migrants were hired in San Francisco each year and dispatched to far-away salmon canneries in Alaska. What was interesting is the fact that the salmon cannery got its start in California. Let's find out who were the pioneers of the salmon canning industry.
When we talk about the pioneers, we must mention the Hume brothers. Without them, there would be no salmon canning industry at the time, and without them, Chinese might never get a foothold in this industry. The first salmon cannery was started by William Hume, George Hume, and Andrew Hapgood, fishermen from the state of Maine. William was the first to come to California in 1852, and his brothers John and George joined him in 1856. This photo shows the site of their salmon cannery on the waterfront of Sacramento near K Street. Today, it is designated as a California landmark. Now, let's find out when and how did the first cannery get started.
Here is what the river looked like in the 1960s. But back in the early spring of 1864, Robert Hume and Andrew Agu joined the three Hume brothers, William, George, and John, in Sacramento. William, George, and Andrew Agu, who was George's friends, quickly formed Agu, Hume, and Company. Where it was William and George who came up with the idea of canning salmon, it was Andrew who had the experience of canning lobster. Together, they started their canning operation on April 1st, 1864. Their cannery was set up on a barge on the waterfront of Sacramento River. The barge was long gone, but we know exactly what it looked like.
This sketch came from a 1903 issue of Pacific Fisherman magazine. It is very realistic because it was drawn under the supervision of George Hume. The Hume brothers live in the cabin right behind the barge. They also added an 18 by 24 extension for a can-making shop. See all those closed windows on the barge? They were guarding their trade secret, which was no more than the cooking process and the amount of salt added. You see, the salt controlled the boiling point, such that it was hot enough to cook the fish, but not too hot to melt the solder. So, Philip, how did they do in the first year?
Canning of salmon was a revolutionary idea, but was easier said than done. They were making canned salmon with crude equipment and had great difficulties in sealing the cans. As a result, 50% of the cans were defective and had to be discarded. By the end of the season, they only made 2,000 cases. It was difficult enough to produce them. However, selling the canned salmon proved to be even more challenging. They paddled door to door in Sacramento without much success. Just as they were about to give up, a merchant in San Francisco bought their entire stock. This allowed their business to continue.
In 1865, the second year of their operation, the Hume brothers and Hapgood were struggling. Their barge sank, and the size of salmon runs was poor. They decided to find a better fishing ground. In 1866, they moved their operation to Eagle Cliff on the Washington side of the Columbia River, as you can see in this picture. In 1867, they hired a few local people and canned 4,000 cases of salmon. For the small startup operation, they faced a lot of challenges, but their fortune was about to change for the better.
Indeed, in 1869, the Hume brothers added a second cannery. Now they were in need of more workers, so they put a help wanted ad in a Portland newspaper. Here is a view of Portland in 1879, still a third-tier city compared with San Francisco. But back in 1870, Portland had a population of 8,000, with 460 Chinese residents and some Chinese migrants. At the time, the Hume brothers' crew consisted of all white men, mostly European immigrants. But George Hume was not entirely happy with them and was open to options. It happened that he had an inside track that allowed him to tap into the Chinese community. Was that so, Jim?
Yes, initially George employed 2 Chinese tinsmiths and a Chinese cook. The Chinese cook, Sam Ma, might be the one who suggested George to hire more Chinese workers. Through his personal connections in Portland's Chinatown, Sam was able to find 12 more workers. They represented only 10% of George's workforce. It happens that they were hired in a year when the U.S. Census was taken. Thanks to the 1870 census, we actually know something about these Chinese workers.
Let's take a closer look at the 1817 census of Waukegan County in Washington, where their cannery was located. We see their names, ages, and how much money they possessed. The oldest was a John, 40 years old, who could be a survivor from the Golden Rush days. A Wu, who who was only 15 years old, must be a newcomer. The average age of the 12 men was 22.5 years old. The group was relatively young because cannery jobs were not the choice of more experienced and older Chinese migrants.
The first Chinese workers must have performed satisfactorily for the Hume brothers because just 2 years later in 1872, through a Chinese contractor, the Hume brothers employed the first entirely Chinese crew. Again, they proved to be efficient and dependable. In 1874, one writer from the Weekly Astorian wrote that the chief reliable form of help seems to be based upon the Chinese, and the fellows appear to apply their several vocations skillfully with limited instruction. It was clear that the Chinese got their foot in the door.
Of all of the 5 Hume brothers who worked in the industry, William, George, John, Joseph, and Robert, it was the youngest brother, Robert, who achieved lasting fame and fortune. Here is a picture of Robert Hume on the left side. In the center, the cannery label he created and fiercely defended. And to the right, the Lower Rock River that he monopolized for his cannery's exclusive use. He also invented machines for fish processing and was influential in business and politics. He was known as the King of Salmon of Oregon.
Taken together, the Hume brothers invested in the salmon canning business and developed the production process. They worked successfully with the Chinese contractors and Chinese workers. What happened was that their success was quickly noticed by other investors who copied their formula, including the hiring of the Chinese workers. Thereby, the Hume brothers set a precedent of production and hiring, which soon became the norm of the new industry.
In part 2, we have 4 segments. We will take a closer look at the Chinese workers, the Chinese contractors, the growth of the salmon canning industry, and the dominance and demise of the Chinese workers in the lower tier of the labor market. Let us first examine the impact of the salmon canning industry on Chinese workers. Here is a graph illustrating the growth of Chinese workers in the canning industry. It shows an explosive growth starting 1870. By 1874, 12 of the 13 Columbia River canneries employed an entirely Chinese crew. By the mid-1870s, the salmon canning industry was well established and provided regular seasonal work to thousands of Chinese migrant workers, surpassing mining and railroad. By 1881, there were 35 canneries employing 4,000 Chinese. As the number of canneries soared, a whole new industry was born. In a way, it was another gold rush for investors and cannery owners. The federal government was fully aware of the new industry and exercised a certain degree of control, including inspection. So what kind of impression did the Chinese workers make on governmental inspectors?
Here's what John Cobb, who was assistant agent at Salmon Fisheries of Alaska, wrote in his 1909 report. No other laborers have ever been found to do the work as well or with as little trouble as the Chinese. In times of heavy rains, when a cannery would have to operate almost night and day in order to take advantage of what might be the last run for the season, the Chinese were always willing, even eager, to do their utmost to fill the cans. The cannery man could almost invariably depend upon the Chinese doing their full duty.
Let me make it clear, Chinese were not the only ones working in the canneries. Besides Chinese, there was a group of white workers. They were fishermen, beach gang technicians, and warehousemen.
For every job inside the cannery, there is at least one other job outside the cannery.
The majority of those jobs were fishermen, as you can see in this photo. Indeed, there was a two-tier system in the labor market. At the upper tier were the white workers who took the skilled and better paid job. They were hired directly by the owners. At the lower tier were the unskilled Chinese workers who were hired by the Chinese contractors and at a lower wage. Let's find out how the Chinese contract system worked.
As shown in this diagram, there is a hierarchical structure with investors at the top of the food chain. The cannery owners who hired the white workers and the Chinese contractors. In turn, the Chinese contractors hired the Chinese workers. As you can see, the Chinese contractor was a middleman between the owner and the Chinese workers. He accepted all responsibilities of hiring and supervising Chinese workers at a set fee. Many contractors were in positions of control and became quite influential and wealthy. Philip, what more can you say about the Chinese contractors?
In the 1870s, Chinese contractors were already active in the railroad industry. Once they saw the increasing demand of Chinese workers in the salmon canning industry, they seized the opportunity and firmly established the Chinese contract system that would last for the next 70 years. So that was how Chinese contractors and workers come to provide reliable and cheap labor in the booming American capitalist economy. But the union of Chinese labor and American capitalism did not last long. In 1882, the influx of Chinese migrant workers was abruptly interrupted by the Chinese Exclusion Act.
After 1882, the entire country was embroiled in anti-Chinese sentiment and unrest. However, because Chinese workers were important to the economy of the canneries, the cannery owners were relatively tolerant of the Chinese workers. For example, in Washington, after Chinese were driven out of many industries, canneries remained as the only industry that Chinese continued to work. In addition, many Chinese left trouble spots in Washington and sought refuge in the cannery town of Astoria, Oregon. In fact, for the following years, the canneries in Columbia River had no trouble finding workers. Philip, what was the situation in Alaska?
In the West Coast, mainly labor leaders and mobs terrorized Chinese communities, and politicians pushed through anti-Chinese legislations. However, the situation in Alaska was different. There were no major concentration of white settlers, and the canneries were located in remote and isolated locations. As a consequence, hiring of Chinese continued in proportion to the growth of the new canneries. The peak occurred in 1902, when 5,300 Chinese worked in Alaska canneries. It was only after 1902 the supply of Chinese labor began to decrease and brought the Chinese dominance to a conclusion in 1910. Now, let's take a minute and review the overall development of the salmon canning industry as a whole from 1870 to 1910.
This graph illustrates the growth pattern of the canning industry from 1870 to 1910, as shown by the number of canneries. The canneries were concentrated in 3 areas. Each color represented a region, and black represents the total count. Canneries in Sacramento River, the yellow line, only enjoyed a brief period of success in the early 1880s and quickly fell into decline. Canneries in Columbia River, the red line, grew explosively in the 1870s, but slowed down in the 1880s and started a decline afterwards due to competition and overfishing. Philip, it appears that the new frontier for the salmon fishing kept shifting north.
That's right. Canneries in Puget Sound is shown here by the blue line. From the late 1880s, Puget Sound took off and matched Columbia River in production. Canneries in Alaska is shown here by the green line. Alaska was a latecomer, but after 1900, Alaska produced more than Columbia River and Puget Sound combined. On the overall, the industry grew by leaps and bounds, as shown by the black line, and it reached a peak in 1902. The last quarter of the 19th century showed dramatic growth, and Alaska became the dominant player. With respect to the growth of the industry, we have some very specific data. Is that right, Jim?
Yes, I thought this cannery map of the West Coast is most helpful. It provides a snapshot of the industry at the turn of the 20th century. You can see that it was published by New York Commercial in 1901 with a headline that reads, "Salmon Canneries of the Pacific West," and points out that this is one of the greatest industries of the Pacific Coast, about which little accurate information has been obtainable. It identifies in the detailed tabulation that there were 2 canneries in Sacramento River, 16 in Columbia River, 19 in Puget Sound, and 42 in Alaska. Philip, what is your take on this cannery map?
This map is very illustrative. The entire Pacific coast of Alaska became the new frontier. But there were a few hidden facts behind what we can see from this map. First, the industry has caught the attention of investors on the East Coast. It was no longer a game for small investors. 2. By 1901, the center of production has already shifted to Alaska. 3. This growth was powered by the availability of Chinese laborers. Now let's review the overall employment pattern of Chinese cannery workers between 1870 and 1910.
The overall rise and fall of the Chinese employment between 1870 and 1910 can be seen in this graph. Essentially, there are 2 peaks. Up to 1884, Chinese employment grew proportionally with the number of canneries, especially in the Columbia River, and the Chinese accounted for more than 80% of the cannery workforce. From 1884 to 1892, the number dropped to a low point. The decrease was due to the decline in salmon runs in the Columbia River, but the impact of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was not immediate. Is that right, Philip?
That's right. In fact, the second peak occurred in 1902 with over 6,000 Chinese, mainly due to the growth in the Alaska canneries, which now accounted for more than 80% of the cannery workforce. However, by 1910, the Chinese workers' population dropped by 50%. This was mainly due to the dwindling and aging Chinese population and the competition from Japanese and Filipinos. So 1910 marked the end of Chinese dominance in the lower tier of the cannery labor market.
After 1910, with an aging population, the Chinese shared the labor market with Japanese, Filipinos, Mexicans, and many other ethnic groups. In this graph, you see the data of Chinese workers in blue. About 400 Chinese workers were still employed in the canneries just before World War II. However, the number dwindled to less than 50 right after World War II. Japanese, in red color, started to enter the labor market around 1900. By 1909, 3,500 Japanese workers were employed in the canneries, and it was almost equal to the Chinese. After the Gentleman's Agreement, which limited the Japanese immigration to the U.S. in 1907, their number began to decline. Japanese workers remained in the canning industry until World War II, while many were interned.
Filipinos started to enter the labor market around the 1910s and become dominant in the 1920s. Filipinos were the driving force in the formation of a new labor union in the late 1930s, which also included Japanese, Chinese, and other ethnicities. However, with the reduction of Chinese population, the internment of Japanese during World War II, Filipinos were left in total control of the union and the cannery labor market. Till the formation of the labor union in 1936, the Chinese contract system was still in use. Looking back historically, the Chinese left the labor market with three significant and lasting legacies. First, a two-tier labor system, an upper and a lower tier, distinguished by race. Two, Asian laborers occupied the lower tier and were hired by Chinese and later Japanese contractors. And three, a contract system that tapped into the global labor market, first Chinese, then Japanese in the 1910s, and finally Filipinos in the 1920s.
In part 3, we will talk about the types of work inside the cannery, the industrialization, the living conditions inside the cannery, and the life of a typical Chinese worker by the turn of the 20th century. First, let's talk about the lives of the Chinese workers in the late 19th century. You might wonder what types of work they did inside the cannery. In the 1880s, Chinese workers were employed to work exclusively on the production lines, from the start where the fishes were loaded to the finish where cans were labeled and packaged. Before the fishing season started, the very first task was making the cans. Philip, what happens in a can making shop?
Initially, all of the cans were made by hand, a laborious process. As depicted in this lithograph, you can see the interior of the workshop with boxes of flat sheets of tin piled up on the floor, workstations towards the back, and a long ramp that allowed the finished can to roll down and drop into a basket. In the first step, the bodies of the cans were cut out by shears, then formed in cylinders and the seams soldered together. In the second step, the bottom of the cans were cut out as circular blanks and placed in a press to form the bottom lids. Finally, the lids were then slipped onto the cylindrical body and soldered together. Cans were made ready before the fishing season got started.
Now, let's talk about the actual fish processing. Once the salmons were caught in the fishing boat, they were often transferred from a fishing boat to a scow. As shown in this photo, this was done manually with a pew, which is a spear with a single prong. Once the scow was filled up, the shipment was transferred and unloaded at the cannery.
Here we see a Chinese in a sea of salmon in a staging area inside the cannery. The fishes had to be first separated by type, such as king, red, silver, pink, or chum. This was done manually by a grader with a pew. A good-sized cannery can process 100,000 fishes a day, and they must be processed by the same day to avoid spoilage.
Here's a picture of the butcher's station in the late 19th century. The butchers cut off the head, tail, fins, and entrails, all in 8 strokes. They throw the fish waste into a trough that dumps directly into the river. The butchers all wear oilskins aprons and rain boots, their hands, gills, and body soaked with water, blood, and fish debris. They typically stand 8 to 10 hours a day. During the peak run, they have to work 16 to 18 hours per day.
Look at the size of those fishes. The red salmon weighs 6 pounds on average, and the king salmon can weigh as much as 50 pounds. How long do you think it takes to clean a 6-pound red salmon? I can perhaps do it in 10 minutes, but those Chinese butchers worked at a speed of 4 to 5 fishes per minute, or 1,500 to 2,000 fishes per day. In fact, they control the speed of the entire production line. The work was strenuous and tedious, but it was also the best paid job.
Here is an 1880s lithograph depicting the production line inside the Kinney Cannery in Astoria, Oregon. As you can see, most of the steps are done manually by Chinese workers. Starting at the lower left, a worker operates a gun knife to cut the salmon into large sections. At the long table, a filler cuts the salmon into smaller sections and stuffs them into a can. Each can is then weighed and adjusted. Behind him, a worker caps the cans and his tinsmith solder the top cover onto the can. Now let my brother Philip explain the rest of the steps, which he's quite familiar with.
Yes, very much so. Start at the upper right station. You see a worker testing for leaky cans. He would dip the cans in hot water and look for air bubbles. Immediately below, the leak cans are sorted out and repairs made. At the top, center, stacked cans were placed on pallets and pressure cooked inside a retort. After cooking, as you can see at the station to the left, the cans go through washing, lacquering, before being stored in a warehouse. Most of the work was done by manual labor, but that was about to change. As we know, the Second Industrial Revolution started in 1870 and lasted till 1914. You must wonder, what was the impact of machines inside salmon canneries?
In the beginning, most work was performed by hand. By the 1890s, with the shortage of Chinese workers, cannery owners were increasingly looking at mechanization as a means to reduce the dependence on the labor force. By the turn of the 20th century, many machines were introduced and the cannery became a much more noisy place. It was like an orchestra of machines. Philip, to what degree were the machines integrated into the production process?
As you can see in this isometric diagram, a cannery was basically a fish processing factory with an assembly of machines connected by conveyor belts. There were many inventions created for the processing of salmon. The long list included machines for cleaning the fish, cutting the fish, filling the cans, topping the cans, cooking the canned salmon, and labeling the cans. Many machines were invented or introduced before 1900, but their use was staggered and varied by the region. On one hand, owners were reluctant to install expensive machines, and on the other hand, Chinese workers were reluctant to work with them. Mechanization of canneries did not take hold till World War I, well beyond the heyday of Chinese workers.
One of the great inventions was the fish cleaning machine. Before its invention, Chinese butchers were controlling the speed of the production line. For many years, dozens of fish cleaning machines were invented and patented, but none worked satisfactorily. It was thought impossible to build a machine that can replace the skillful Chinese butchers. Eventually, it happened. A Canadian named Edmund Smith invented it in 1903. The machine was fast and can replace 20 Chinese butchers. It cleans a fish by removing its head, tail, fins, and entrails, as shown in this diagram.
The machines made inroad slowly and gained widespread use only in the 1920s, and did eventually replace all of the Chinese butchers. It is ironic that Edmund named his machine the Iron Chink. The name has a derogatory overtone and has since been changed to Smith's Butcher Machine. Invariably, new machines began to replace workers. Instead of machines that supplemented man's work, men were now working in a supporting role. We have shown a snapshot of Chinese workers inside salmon canning canneries. This was how the Chinese migrants come to participate in the American capitalist economy and the industrialization of the American West.
Now let's find out about the living conditions of Chinese workers inside the canneries. Most of the Alaska canneries were in remote areas, accessible only by sea. Here is a photo of an orca cannery in central Alaska in 1899. The environment of a cannery varies from region to region. In southeast Alaska, the climate is temperate, the landscape covered with pine forests. Central Alaska is colder. The landscape can be dramatic with the snow-peaked mountains and glaciers. Western Alaska Peninsula can be bitterly cold and the land barren and desolate. There can be a rich variety of experiences working in Alaska.
Back in those early days, Chinese and the white men each had their own bunkhouse and mess house. The quality of living standards and food were quite different. The white workers were employees of the canning company. The Chinese workers were not. They were employed by the Chinese contractor and supervised by Chinese boss. Housing was provided by the cannery workers. Let's take a look at the housing situation.
This is a bunkhouse at the Diamond NN Cannery in Bristol Bay, constructed in 1895. Each had 12 bunk beds and housed 24 Chinese workers. Each bunk bed was called China House, and the cluster of these bunkhouses was called Chinatown. In many cases, they were shabby in construction, made of rough-cut lumber and corrugated metal roof. There were gaps between the floor planks, and cold wind seeped through the holes. There were no interior finishes, no furniture, just 2 rows of bunk beds with no mattresses. This is not exactly the log cabins inside a national park.
There were really not much amenity to speak of. There were no stoves for heating. There were no hot water for shower. You might have some shallow pans for bathing purpose. No toilet. There might be an outhouse. And definitely, as far as laundry is concerned, you had to do it yourself. You might catch the smell of sewer and decayed fish parts dumped into the sea. The situation went from bad to worse towards the 1930s, till the Union took over and forced many of the improvements.
The workers usually did not get to eat salmons. The cost of food was tightly controlled by the Chinese contractor. This was one place he always made money. A meager Chinese diet typically included 4 items. 1. Rice. 2. Dry or preserved vegetables. 3. Scrap fish and pork. And 4. Hot tea.
Chinese cook and worker must improvise. They might have a vegetable garden in the front and live hogs and chicken in the backyard. They might supplement their diet with fresh fish and clams caught by the workers. Food was prepared in the traditional Chinese style, and they ate with rice bowls and chopsticks. The situation varied, but it appeared if the cook and the workers worked together, they could manage to feed themselves in a half-decent manner. Let's see what the Chinese worker did in their spare time.
Workers were trapped in isolated locations for the duration of the season, with nothing to do except work, eat, and sleep. However, in their spare time, they spent it on fishing, gardening, gathering food, hiking, gaming, gambling, drinking, and smoking. Time was also spent attending to their personal matters such as laundry, grooming, and attending their queues.
Some social interaction among workers based on home origin, kinship, and clan relationship was likely. Meal and after-meal time was opportunities for gossip and storytelling. As the years went by, social exchange inevitably became less frequent and perhaps more constrained and pessimistic. Not much organized nightlife and very limited interaction with Alaskan natives. It was perhaps an interesting experience working in Alaska. You can only imagine a variety of Chinese stories that change with location, time, and age. But there were few personal accounts or documents left.
Now we're going to give you a quick sketch of the life of a Chinese worker in San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century. Imagine that he came to this country from China before 1882 as a young man. By 1900, he would be middle-aged and remained a bachelor. He had worked in the canneries for about 20 years.
He lived in a cheap lodge in San Francisco Chinatown, mostly isolated and insulated from the white American society. He maintained contact with town and belonged to a family association. He spent time loitering around, engaging himself in habits such as smoking, drinking, and gambling. He kept his pigtail, hoping to return to China someday. He had come to depend on cannery work as his main source of income. Every spring, he visited his contractor and waited to be dispatched.
In March, he got on a windjammer and sailed to Alaska. This picture shows Chinese workers loading up the ship with supplies in San Francisco in April 1906. It would take about 5 weeks for the old barge to sail from San Francisco to Bristol Bay. He was just one of the thousands of Chinese who made the annual trip.
From the picture, the ship looks so majestic and romantic. This particular ship is called Baccalaureate. It was also known as Star of Alaska. In the early 20th century, Alaska Packer Association used to own a fleet of salmon ships. But by now, Star of Alaska is only one of the 2 remaining. You can visit it at the San Francisco Maritime Museum. But the cannery ship was no cruise ship and the trip was no vacation. In fact, the journey was treacherous and the sleeping condition on the ship so terrible that by the 1920s, they had become known as the Hell Ship. Getting safely to Alaska on board a windjammer was only half of the game, but that's another story.
In late April, after arriving in the cannery, he started making cans. Here's a real photo of the Chinese can. Look at their faces and hairstyle. They were all seasoned workers, and most of them probably knew each other. It was almost a ritual for them to make the annual trip. The actual fishing and canning seasons started in June and lasted until August. He worked hard and appreciated every opportunity to work overtime.
Here we see the Chinese cannery workers on board a ship named Harvester. They were en route from Cook's Inlet to San Francisco. The time was 1899. For the Chinese worker in question, the canning season ended in August. By the time the ship set sail and brought him back to San Francisco, the autumn leaves were turning brown, and it was September.
He spent the off-season looking for odds and ends jobs. Rest assured that he, at least, had a dependable cannery job and looked forward to next spring to sail again. He sent his money back to China on a regular basis. He lived out his life in the gold mountain, but never made enough money to become rich or return home. For most, their dream did not end on a high note, but they persevered. In one of the most interesting and challenging chapters of Chinese American history. Okay, next we're going to share our own experience working in Alaska. We were dispatched to Waterfall Cannery in 1970. That's exactly 100 years after the first group of Chinese were hired by George Hume in 1870.
Waterfall is located on the west edge of the Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska. It's about 50 miles away from Ketchikan on the mainland. The 2,500 square meter island is covered with steep mountains and dense forest. It can only be reached by air or by sea.
Just a few days after we were dispatched, we were on our way to Alaska. We first flew from Seattle to Ketchikan. On our way there, we saw countless number of islands. It was certainly a different scenery. In Ketchikan, we made a transfer and took a small seaplane. This photo was taken just before we were ready to embark.
As we approach our destination, the airplane was making a semi-half circle in the air, and looking down out of the blue, we saw this beautiful village below. It is the compound of our cannery. From the air, it looks just like a perfect place for a summer vacation or an adventure.
As we got off the seaplane, suddenly we realized that we were far away from civilization. For the next month and a half, we would have no contact with the rest of the world. No TV, no radio, and no newspaper.
The two buildings in the foreground is the fish house to your right and the warehouse to your left. The interior of the fish house is huge, but dim, wet, and noisy. All the machines were old and dated back to the 1930s. My job is to check cans at the can filling machine. And there was not much talking, not only because the machines were noisy, but also we had to concentrate on our tasks just to keep up with the speed of the production line.
My job was an egg puller inside the fish house. Occasionally, I also work at the egg house to help packing the salmon rolls. Here's a photo that we took at the back of the egg house. Workers came from all different backgrounds. Here we see 2 Filipinos, 2 Chinese, 2 Japanese foreign students, and 6 Japanese workers and a white worker. The egg house was run by Japanese, and I remember I reported to Mr. Fuji.
Not too far away from the egg house is a boardwalk along the lagoon. The end of the boardwalk takes you to a trailhead and leading you into the forest. Hiking was the most popular activity for workers. We usually hike on Sundays. And this is a typical view along the trail. As you can see, different type of vegetations. It's a mix of spruce, cedar, and hemlock. The air quality was cool and crisp. But what was the most striking was just the tranquility and the quietness of the place. That's something you surely appreciate after working inside the factory for 6 days. After a good half an hour of hike, we would reach our destination. Here you see the real waterfall that gives name to the place and to the cannery. I should also point out that the freshwater supply was critical to the operation of a cannery. You also notice we were all wearing sweaters and light jacket.
This is a view from the dock behind the egg house. The ocean view was especially beautiful during the sunrise and sunset. One time we were on a rowboat out in the open sea, and we were surprised when we saw a whale emerging out of the calm water. That was both amazing and scary. It was certainly, the highlight of that day.
Waterfall was established by a group of commercial fishermen in 1912. In the front, you can see the wharf where the water is deep enough for a commercial ship to load and dock. And from the very beginning, Waterfall was designed as a self-contained community for seasonal workers. It only opens on summers, during the summers.
Many of the buildings were constructed in the 1930s, including the 2 main buildings. And here, as you can see by my pointer, this is a row of cottages, and it says natives. So this must be the place for the fishermen, for the Native Americans. Over here in the center the writing says Filipino house. So that's the bunkhouse where the workers stayed. So that's where we stayed. Here is another bunkhouse. And behind the bunkhouse, there's a lagoon. And right next to the lagoon, there's carpenter's shop. And to the furthest left, that's the mess hall. And we have, next to it, we have a radio transmitter. And here are two houses. I'm sure it's for the supervisor and the managers. We have a company store here. And a little bit to the right is a fish ladder. That's for the fishing boat and for the tender, for the dock, and unload the salmons.
Waterfall Cannery was expanded and modernized in the 1930s, and at the time it was the finest cannery in Southeast Alaska. In 1936, it produced 310,000 cases, a record for that year. During World War II, canned salmon was part of the ration for troops of Allied forces. But after the 1970 season, the cannery was abruptly shut down. And in fact, we were the last crew on the cannery. And at the time, we had no idea of what happened. And it's only recently we found out the situation.
Well, guess what happened? In 1980, Waterfall was converted into a sports fishing resort where everyone can go there fishing and experience the tranquility and scenery. I looked it up online, for a 4 days, 3 night package, you have to spend about $5,000 and you can stay in a bunkhouse. That's exactly where we stayed for free. If you want something a little bit better, you can stay in the cottages where the fishermen used to stay. And of course, if you want the best, you can always stay at the premium egg house suite. That's where I used to work. When I first saw this picture, I broke into laughter. I said, this is just amazing. There's so much change, and the transformation is just totally beyond me. So over the last 150 years, the salmon canning industry has seen many ups and downs. Today, the industry has stabilized after a period of decline. Many canneries were closed. And here we see how one cannery has transformed itself in the 21st century. Okay, I'm going to stop the video. Back to you, Maggie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim and Philip. Yeah, I think it was really fascinating when you talk. I think one of the things that kind of boggles me, and it's kind of funny, you talk about how Waterfall is now a resort. And so I'm glad the cannery is still there. It's just kind of weird just how it's kind of been changed. And it seems like that's happened to a lot of the cannery buildings. Now they've been changed into something else. But also thank you for this fascinating history. We have a few questions. I'm going to start with one of my own, and then I'm going to kind of turn it over to participants. Everyone still has time to submit questions if they would like. But my question for both you, for Jim and Philip, is why is the Chinese story in the salmon canning industry not as well known as some of the other stories or some of the other histories that are often discussed in regards to Chinese American history?
Philip, would you want to start?
Yeah, I think there are several reasons that the Chinese story was not really well known. And one part is the fact it's the lack of continuity, because you realize, we talked about today in our today's coverage, that the dominance of the Chinese migrants started from 1870 and it stopped at 1910. And so after 1910, the Chinese migrant workers population decreased dramatically, and by the start of World War II and World War I, it keeps diminishing. So one part is this just the complete discontinuity because after almost 1910, 1920, we're talking about just dozens every year. You're not talking about hundreds, you're not talking about thousands. So that's one part, that there's no continuity anymore. And I guess the other part really is when you look at it, when I say no continuity, because the Chinese come here as a single person, a single unmarried man. And when they get old, they don't have kids. So their career and their profession is not carried by their family. So that's what we mean by discontinuity.
Thank you, Philip. Our first question is going to come from Derek, and he's going to ask that question live. I'm going to help him turn. Oh, cool.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. Great presentation. The photos and your personal experience really added to the presentation. My question is, with respect to Sacramento, I saw a plaque and I didn't recognize the picture. Can you be a little bit more specific about where exactly in Sacramento the location of where the salmon canning was occurring?
Yeah, the location, if I understand it right, it's near K Street. Okay, now, so Sacramento River and K Street, that's where the plaque is located.
Okay.
And what happened is there's a long story because there used to be another plaque. Okay, used to be right now this is California. Okay, before it was the United States. So it was a little bit different. And what happened was that because the river has changed its course over the years, so the exact location is actually not very clear.
Okay, I'll have to look for it. And part of the reason I ask is there was a location that was very close to that area called China Slough. And I was wondering if there was any interaction with the Chinese in that area, which was very close to the location that you're describing.
Well, the location is actually very close to Sacramento Chinatown. So the Hume brothers, when they built the first cannery, they did not hire any Chinese at the time. They are very familiar with the Chinese population in the area, but they did not hire any Chinese until they moved to Columbia River 2 or 3 years later.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. Our next question, so our next few questions, the participants decided that I would be speaking them to you. So the first question comes from David, and David asks, do you know where the first workers came from Kaiping or Taishan? I'm not know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Kaiping or Taishan?
Taisan, yes.
Taisan. Sorry about my pronunciation.
And Kaiping or Taisan. I think we can look at the resources of where the Chinese workers come from. First, we have to look at the contractors because most of them are solicited by Chinese contractors. And they have a few sources of labor. First is through their personal contact, maybe through the town, through the association. And so if they are personally from Taisan, they would be more inclined to hire people from Taisan because that's their family relation and connection. However, they also recruit people through advertisement, so through local newspapers, and so that is really going to be another source of their labor. Then finally, some of them are probably recruited directly from China. Probably not a big portion, but some of them were probably recruited directly from China. But you must realize that all this recruiting was happening after 1869. That's after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. So there were a lot of labor in the market, a lot of migrants looking for jobs.
All right, thank you, Philip. And David had a few more questions. I'm going to get back to those in a moment. The next question comes from Frank Wu. He says, he wrote that my understanding is that the salmon was considered cheap, but at some point in American history, it moved up market and became a premium fish. Do you know when that happened, and did it affect Chinese immigrants favorably?
I
Well,
would just, yeah, go
Philip,
ahead.
you go ahead first.
Okay, I would say that after World War II and then throughout all the way into the 1950s and 60s, the cannery market was really going up and down. And then in 1959, Alaska became a state, and it was no longer a territory. So it took control of the fishery, and it instituted a lot more stringent regulations. So on the whole, the production was declining, but the cost was rising. So this is one factor. The second factor is the fact of machinery, because refrigeration was really not popular. You know, refrigerators, especially in homes and also in commercial uses, are not really that frequent till the 1960s and 1950s. And so when commercial refrigeration become popular, now the salmon doesn't have to be canned. They can be shipped through refrigerated ships and trucks directly into the market. So that's the second factor. And so then thirdly, because the commercial taste actually changed, people was no longer looking for salmon as the prime, as a dish. So I think for all those reasons, the marketing strategy utilized by the canneries changed too. They decided they would advertise fresh salmon as premium meat,
Okay.
and like they can definitely get a much better pricing and profit and return. So it's all those combination of factors that made that change. And as far as the impact on the Chinese migrants and workers are concerned, it was really no impact, because the Chinese has long disappeared from the picture, because after 1930, the practically speaking Chinese actually was no longer in the picture.
Okay, thank you. Jim, did you have more you wanted to add to the question?
No, I think he said pretty much said all. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Our next question comes from Amy, and she's actually going to ask the question live.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I actually have two very different questions. One following up on David's earlier question about whether the workers came from Kaiping or Taishan. Were there specific villages that many of the workers may have come from, or specific family surnames, like were they mostly Lees or Moys? And then a second question, which is different, that I have is, we know that the Chinese are very entrepreneurial and enterprising. Did any of the workers take from the cannery experience knowledge and start their own industries, or maybe bring some of this canning industry to China maybe? So sorry, two very different questions.
No, I think on the first question, where they come from, that's a little bit difficult to track. The whole reason is because the Chinese migrants has not left any record, very few record. And that census we show in 1870, so every 10 years, there's a census. So that's probably the only time you have a record of those migrants. And but other than that, there are no personal records left, unfortunately, of all the thousands of Chinese went to Alaska and in the different countries. There's no documents, there's no diary, there's no writing, and there's only very few writings that's been left. But we can, in general terms, we all know that all the Chinese, most of them come from Canton, and from Canton they come from a specific, the four-county region, and in Chinese they call it 四夷. I hope I pronounce it correctly, but they come from 4 different county regions, and so that much we can tell, and whether they come specifically from which county or which village, that's a little bit hard to trace. But last year we actually saw we were in contact with this lady in Alaska. She's a historian, and she actually sent us some pictures of some of the graveyards and the gravestones, and there's 2 of them that are still readable, and one of them, it's clearly on the top, it says 四夷. It identifies where this person come from, and so that to me actually was very impressive. You know, they're still using the traditional Chinese grave marker and identify where they come from, when were they born, and when did they passed away.
Yeah, in terms of the business, I think, the Chinese were entrepreneurs, and some of them, after working in the cannery for a couple of years, some were probably want to move up. Okay, and the only way they can probably move up is to become, maybe some of them get involved in the contracting business. And however, I don't think any of them bring those cannery skills back to China. So I believe, so they're basically, either in the contract business or move up doing the or get into other business, but definitely not much which we can trace back to.
There was a swift trade, though, in dried seafood. I mean, the export of the drying seafood from America and exporting it back to China, though.
That's entirely possible, because the whole point is that once they have accumulated enough capital, now they have all kinds of opportunities. And so import-export was, yes, in fact, that was one of the major area that they have opportunities.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Amy. Our next question is from David, and he asks if you know anything about what drove the Filipino workers to the West Coast. And he said, like, their dominance of the canning industry was around the same time of their appearance in California working the fields. Do you guys have any knowledge about Filipino workers in the canning industry?
Yeah, I think the Filipinos, they started to come to the United States in the 1910s. And at the time, it's very hard for them to find jobs, just like the Chinese. So their only opportunities either work in the farms or work in the canneries. So for a period of time, a significant number of Filipinos were working in the canneries. And eventually they dominated the cannery workforce by the late 1930s.
And also at the time, the Chinese was not, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese was not allowed to enter the country, but the Filipinos were allowed to enter. So that's where they took the opportunity and they moved in.
Thank you. The next question is coming from Pauline.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I have 2 questions. One is, why was it called the Egg House? And then the second question is, what could you buy at the company store?
The egg house is used to process salmon eggs, which is something that the Orientals, especially Japanese, they love to eat the salmon rolls. So egg house is usually run by the Japanese, start in the 1960s. And you can find it almost in every cannery. And usually, the Japanese companies send several technicians to each cannery, and they supervise the operation at the egg house. Hey, Maggie,
Yeah, the other question is about the company store. And the company store, I think they supply probably like a small grocery shop, and some of the daily, utilities, and also probably, cigarettes, wine, and maybe, toothbrush and blankets, shoes. So just some of the general supply, and it's very small, just in a small quantity. Now, of course, I'm sure they probably have some candy bars and slacks. Yeah, slacks. So I think that's the general stuff they would carry.
Thank you.
hey, Maggie, can I interrupt and maybe it's
Yes.
a time. It's a good time I can introduce a very special friend who is has worked in the salmon cannery for over 50 years. Okay, and I think he has his story is really something which is very interesting, and I would like to introduce him, and he can share his experience with us. Can we have Fred Wong? Is Fred on the line?
Who was he? Do you remember who he was coming with?
Fred, he should be.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, here you go.
Okay, I'm on then, huh? You can hear me?
We can see you. Have you turned on your video?
Sure. I press the button and it should allow you to turn on your video if you would like to, Fred.
Oh, that's okay. Just as long as you can hear me. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I started working in the canneries in 1953. My first job was in Ketchikan with the Fidalgo Island Packing Company. In those days, it was a closed shop, so you had to go to the union in Seattle, International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen Union, Local 37 in Seattle. In 1952, there were 10 Chinese in my cannery at Ketchikan. By 1953, 3 of them dropped off, so I replaced 3 of them, 1 Chinese for 3. They got me through the union. And then from Seattle, we went to Ketchikan, and there was a small 1-line cannery. They did not have a casing machine, so we did everything hand packing, hand casing. That was my first job in Alaska, working in a warehouse, hand casing. Okay, in 1954, the season was very bad. In 1953, we only packed 6,000 cases in 2 months. So we had a reduction in force, and I was riffed. I was very disappointed, of course, but actually it was a good move because I had to go back to the union every day for about 2 weeks, and I finally got on again under another cannery. Pacific American Fisheries had a string of canneries in Alaska, and they had one on the southern end of Kodiak Island called Alatak. So I was sent there, and that was a big plant, a 3-line cannery. My first job was working in a fish house, sliming fish, cleaning fish, because the butcher machines never clean all the fish. Oftentimes we'll leave a fin or some fish line, bloodline had to be cleaned up by hand. So I worked there in the fish house for 2 years as a slimer. But that first season, in one day, we packed as much fish as we did the whole season in Ketchikan, with 6,000 cases a day. It was a lot of fish. So of course, next year, I went back went back to the same cannery because I had 1 year seniority. And from there, I worked in went to the can shop in 1956, I think it was. And from there, and the next season I was in the warehouse for a couple of seasons before I went in the Army. So after I got discharged from the Army, I'm a career teacher, so I have my summers free. So I thought, well, I'm the summers free, I'll go back to Alaska for work a few more seasons. Well, I got into be a habit, one season after another, and it turned out to be a career. But I didn't intend to do that in the beginning. So I worked 53 seasons in the same plant. In 1969, I've been a casing machine operator a couple of years, and in 1969 they promoted me to head warehouse. And then 1971 to second foreman. And in 1972, first foreman. So I helped run the plant. And during my time as a foreman, I hired many, many Chinese, dozens of them, men and women. And some seasons, excuse me, some seasons I would go down to Stockton and hire my Filipino crew. And our living quarters were 2 people to a room, and we ate our meals in a mess hall, family style. As the foreman, I ate in the blue room called with the superintendent and the beach gang boss and so forth like that. We had a very busy season all the time. My last season was 2008, the 53rd season at Altac.
Wow. That's amazing, Fred. I'm just totally amazed. I only work at...
If I knew you guys wanted a job back in 1970, I would have hired you.
Oh.
So the Chinese,
I was already in Alaska.
so the Chinese you were hiring way back, were they students or who were they? Were they seasoned workers?
Yeah, you know how it is in the canneries. It's migratory workers or else students.
Yeah.
That have their time free during the summertime.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fred. That was, yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think Fred has so much story. He's got such a long history of working in the canneries. From my point of view, he's almost a legend as a cannery worker. Yeah.
Yeah, our bunkhouse was different than yours. Our bunkhouse had rooms and two people in each room. That's all.
Well, that's really luxury because in our old days, the bunkhouse was it's more like a dormitory. You know, you have probably 20 or 30 beds on, going down the hall. But you also mentioned that your daughters worked in the canneries too, right?
Oh yes, all 3 of my daughters worked in Alaska. My oldest daughter asked me when she was 15, said, "Dad, when can I go to Alaska with you?" I said, "You're too young." Well, next year she was 16. I was able to take her because I would sign a release form, for a reminder to work in the cannery. And her 2 sisters did the same thing. They went when they were 16.
Fred, is it okay? We have a question that came into the chat room. if you're able to answer. Robin wanted to know where the Chinese women and men came from that you recruited.
The Chinese women I recruited were all from Portland. And there's quite a few of them that I hired over the years.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, there was three, historically, there are three recruiting centers. One in San Francisco, one in Portland, and then in Seattle. Eventually, when the union took over, the recruiting center, Seattle became the only recruiting center for a long time.
Yeah, my original cannery in 1953 was a Portland cannery. I mean, the crew all came from Portland. They would come here to get dispatched. All the Filipinos too.
we have one more question that I'm going to ask, and then we're going to kind of, I think everyone, Jim, Philip, and Fred could answer this, and then we're going to kind of wrap things up. But the last question is, how much could you make in a summer? Why did you guys continuously go back to the canning industry?
Well,
Okay.
back in 1953 is about $500–600 a season.
The entire summer?
2 months, but it was a guaranteed payment in those days. If there's fish to work on, fine. If there wasn't fish, you still got paid.
Okay.
Yeah, in 1970, we were making about, I would say, $1,200 to $1,500 for the summer. For the second year, I made it about $3,000 because I worked in 2 canneries. So the pay was really good for college students, especially just for 2 months work during the summer.
Well, my
Remember
first
this one?
season in Ketchikan, we only worked half a day because by the time noontime came around, we were all done already. So we went to town in the afternoon. It was that bad of a season. I didn't get one single hour of overtime. So that's why it was $500 for the whole season.
Okay.
But remember back in the 1970s, the tuition for state colleges was so inexpensive. At University of Washington, the tuition, I believe, was like $900. So that's why, $1,500, $1,600 was quite a large sum.
That involved a lot of overtime too.
Right.
Well, thank you everyone so much. That's very fascinating history, and just based on reading just what everyone's saying in the chat room, everyone very much enjoyed the program. We did have a few questions we didn't answer, and we have everyone's emails collected. If you have further questions, please contact info@chsa.org, and we will help put you in contact with Jim and Philip so they can provide more answers to your questions. And I know a few people had sent their emails and they want, contact with Jim and Philip to kind of talk more about their family history and their research. So we really appreciate this kind of scholarly community that we're kind of putting together to do more research about an industry that hasn't had as much focus. And I really appreciate Jim and Philip for sharing this today, because this is something I didn't know a lot about, and I think that's a lot of people joining. That's a big part of Chinese American history we should show more. So again, thank you, and we're going to be signing off now. Goodbye, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Fred.
I'll be talking to you sometime on the phone.
Yeah,
Thank
I will
you.
talk to you soon.